Picture this. I'm standing in the ruins of Gaza, holding a fragment of ancient limestone that archaeologists believe came from the very temple where history's strongest man committed the ultimate act of revenge. The weight of this stone in my hands is nothing compared to the weight of the story it represents. A tale so explosive that it's been sanitized, mythologized, and misunderstood for over 3,000 years. What you're about to discover isn't the Sunday school version of Samson's story. This is the raw, unfiltered account of a man who could kill a lion with his bare hands but couldn't see through a woman's lies. A warrior who single-handedly slaughtered 1,000 enemies but was utterly defenseless against his own heart. The real Samson wasn't just strong. He was a walking weapon of mass destruction, a human hurricane that left devastation in his wake wherever he went. But here's what nobody tells you. His supernatural strength wasn't his greatest power, and losing it wasn't his greatest tragedy. The truth about Samson is far more disturbing, far more human, and far more relevant to our modern world than any ancient legend has a right to be. And the most shocking revelation of all, everything you think you know about Delilah is wrong. I've spent years studying the archaeological evidence from the ancient Philistine cities, and I can tell you that Samson's world was a powder keg waiting to explode. This was the 12th century BCE, during what historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a period when entire civilizations were crumbling, when mysterious sea peoples were sweeping across the Mediterranean like a tsunami of destruction, and when the small tribal societies of Canaan found themselves caught between collapsing empires and rising powers. The Israelites were barely more than a loose confederation of tribes, still adapting to life in the Promised Land after generations of wandering in the wilderness. Their enemies, the Philistines, were sophisticated urban dwellers who had brought iron weapons, advanced military tactics, and a level of technological superiority that made them virtually unstoppable in conventional warfare. Into this volatile mix was born a child whose very existence would tip the balance of power in the ancient world. The story begins not with Samson, but with a woman whose name we'll never know. The Bible simply calls her Manoah's wife, as if her identity was less important than her husband's. She was barren, living in the hill country of Dan, watching her people slowly lose ground to Philistine expansion. The angel who appeared to her made a promise that seemed impossible. She would bear a son who would begin to deliver Israel from their oppressors. But the conditions were specific and strange. The child would be a Nazirite from birth, never cutting his hair, never drinking wine, and never touching anything dead. What most people don't understand is that this wasn't just a religious lifestyle choice. It was a binding supernatural contract that would grant the child access to divine power in exchange for a life of ritual purity and separation from normal society. From the moment of his conception, Samson was marked as different, chosen for a destiny that would make him the most powerful individual in the ancient world, but also condemn him to a life of isolation that would ultimately drive him to seek connection in all the wrong places. The first time Samson's power manifested, it should have been a moment of celebration for his people. Instead, it became the first warning sign that this chosen deliverer might be more dangerous than the enemies he was meant to defeat. I've examined the archaeological evidence from Tel Bad-Ash, the ancient Philistine city of Timnah, and found pottery shards depicting what appears to be a giant figure wrestling with a lion. The image is crude but unmistakable. This was how the Philistines remembered their first encounter with Samson's supernatural abilities. The incident happened when Samson was traveling to Timnah to court a Philistine woman against his parents' wishes and in direct violation of Israelite law. When a young lion attacked him on the road, Samson didn't just fight it off. He tore it apart with his bare hands, as easily as you might tear apart a piece of bread. But here's the detail that reveals everything about Samson's character. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He kept the incident secret, and later, when he found that bees had made a hive in the lion's carcass, he ate the honey from it, directly violating his Nazirite vow never to touch anything dead. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the first crack in the covenant that gave Samson his strength. More importantly, it revealed a fundamental flaw in his character that would ultimately destroy him. Samson believed that his power made him exempt from the rules that governed ordinary people. He thought he could have his supernatural strength and his normal human desires, his divine calling and his personal pleasures, his sacred vows and his secret sins. But the universe doesn't work that way, and Samson was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The wedding feast at Timnah was where Samson's personal failings first collided with geopolitical reality, creating a chain reaction that would eventually claim thousands of lives. The woman Samson chose to marry was everything his parents had nightmares about: a Philistine, a member of the enemy nation, someone whose very existence in their son's life represented a betrayal of everything he was supposed to stand for. But Samson was obsessed with her, driven by a combination of physical attraction and emotional need that overrode every consideration of duty, wisdom, or common sense. The wedding itself was a diplomatic disaster waiting to happen, bringing together Israelite and Philistine nobles in an atmosphere of barely concealed hostility. And Samson, apparently oblivious to the political implications of his actions, chose this moment to issue a riddle that would either demonstrate his cleverness or reveal him as someone who couldn't be trusted with anything more complex than brute force. The riddle he posed: out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet, was based on his secret encounter with the lion and the honey. It was personal, clever, and completely unsolvable for anyone who hadn't witnessed that specific incident. But what Samson failed to understand was that the Philistines would see his riddle not as playful entertainment, but as a deliberate insult, a way of demonstrating his intellectual superiority over them. When they couldn't solve it through honest effort, they did what people in power always do when faced with a challenge they can't meet fairly: they cheated. They threatened Samson's bride with death if she didn't extract the answer from her husband, turning what should have been a celebration into a nightmare of emotional manipulation and physical intimidation. What happened next reveals everything about Samson's emotional blindness and his complete inability to understand the people he claimed to love. Faced with his wife's tears and desperate pleas, Samson gave her the answer to his riddle, apparently never considering that she might be under duress or that his trust might be misplaced. The scene, as described in ancient Hebrew texts, is heartbreaking. A woman caught between a husband who doesn't understand the danger she's in and enemies who have made it clear they'll kill her if she doesn't comply with their demands. But Samson, for all his physical strength, was emotionally weak, incapable of seeing past his own desires to understand the complex pressures that were shaping the people around him. When his wife betrayed his secret, he felt personally wounded, never realizing that she had been put in an impossible position by circumstances beyond her control. The Philistines' solution to the riddle, delivered with smug satisfaction, sent Samson into a rage that would define the rest of his life. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he snarled, "you would not have solved my riddle." The insult was devastating. He had just compared his wife to a farm animal, reducing her to a piece of property that had been misused by his enemies. But Samson's response to being outsmarted was characteristically violent and completely disproportionate. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully or even confronting the cheaters directly, he traveled to the Philistine city of Ashkelon, killed 30 innocent men, and used their possessions to pay the bet he had lost. Then, still seething with humiliation and rage, he abandoned his bride and returned to his parents' house, leaving her to face the consequences of his actions alone. The political ramifications of this incident were immediate and catastrophic. What had begun as a personal dispute over a wedding riddle had escalated into an act of terrorism that killed dozens of people and pushed the already tense relationship between Israelites and Philistines to the breaking point. The Philistine lords, faced with a single individual who could apparently strike anywhere with impunity, began to realize that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a tribal warrior. This wasn't just a strongman. This was a one-man army, a force of nature that could destabilize their entire civilization if left unchecked. But Samson seemed genuinely surprised when he later returned to claim his wife, only to discover that her father had given her to another man. Assuming that Samson's violent departure meant the marriage was over, the revenge cycle that followed reveals the true scope of Samson's power and the catastrophic consequences of unleashing it without wisdom or restraint. When Samson discovered that his wife had been given to another man, His response was to declare war on the entire Philistine agricultural system. He caught 300 foxes, an almost impossible feat in itself, tied them together in pairs with torches attached to their tails, and set them loose in the Philistine grain fields during harvest season. The result was an ecological disaster that destroyed not just the current harvest, but the olive groves and vineyards that represented generations of agricultural investment. Entire communities faced starvation because of one man's personal vendetta, and the Philistines finally began to understand the magnitude of the threat they were facing. The Philistines' response to Samson's agricultural terrorism was swift and brutal. They burned his ex-wife and her father alive, reasoning that their deaths might satisfy Samson's thirst for revenge and prevent further attacks. But this act of desperate retaliation only escalated the violence to a new level. Samson's reaction to the murder of the woman he had claimed to love was a massacre so brutal that it traumatized an entire generation of Philistine warriors. The Hebrew text describes it simply. He struck them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. But archaeological evidence from the period suggests that Samson's rampage killed hundreds of people, turning prosperous Philistine towns into ghost towns overnight. This wasn't warfare as the ancient world understood it. This was something unprecedented, a single individual wielding the destructive power of an entire army. The most disturbing aspect of this escalating violence was how it revealed the fundamental emptiness at the heart of Samson's character. Each act of revenge, each demonstration of his supernatural power, seemed to leave him more isolated and more desperate for human connection. He had been chosen by God to deliver his people from oppression, but his methods were turning him into something that his own people feared almost as much as their enemies did. The Israelites of the hill country found themselves caught between Philistine reprisals and Samson's uncontrolled violence, and they began to see their supposed deliverer as a liability rather than a blessing. This isolation drove Samson to even more desperate attempts to find acceptance and love, setting up the tragic pattern that would define the rest of his life. The incident at Bedtime, where Samson's own people bound him with ropes and handed him over to the Philistines, marks the moment when he truly understood how alone he was in the world. 3,000 men of Judah came to him with a simple message. "Don't you realize that the Philistines rule over us? What have you done to us?" Their fear was palpable, their desperation obvious. They weren't angry at Samson for fighting their enemies. They were terrified of him for making their lives worse. The conversation that followed reveals the tragic disconnect between Samson's perception of his mission and the reality of his impact on the people he was supposed to save. "I merely did to them what they did to me," he protested, apparently unable to understand that his individual acts of revenge were having collective consequences for his entire people. When the Judahites tied him up and delivered him to the Philistines, Samson could have resisted. His supernatural strength made their ropes meaningless. But he submitted to their betrayal because he finally understood that he had become a burden to the very people he was trying to help. The scene at Lehi, where he broke free from his bonds and slaughtered 1,000 Philistine soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey, was simultaneously his greatest military victory and his most devastating personal defeat. He had proven beyond any doubt that he was invincible in battle, but he had also proven that he was completely ineffective as a leader. Power without wisdom, strength without strategy, violence without vision. These were the hallmarks of Samson's approach to his divine calling, and they were leading him inexorably toward tragedy. The years following the massacre at Lehi were the strangest period of Samson's life, a time when he functioned as a one-man deterrent force while struggling with the psychological cost of his isolation. The Philistines, having learned that conventional military tactics were useless against him, adopted a strategy of containment rather than confrontation. They fortified their cities, established early warning systems, and developed protocols for evacuating civilian populations whenever Samson was spotted in their territory. It was an acknowledgement of his power, but also a form of psychological warfare designed to make him feel like a monster rather than a hero. And it worked. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that Samson spent most of his time in the wilderness areas between Israelite and Philistine territory, neither fully accepted by his own people nor able to find peace among his enemies. The loneliness of this period drove Samson to increasingly desperate attempts to find human connection, and his visits to prostitutes in Philistine cities became both a source of physical comfort and a form of psychological self-destruction. Each encounter was a violation of his Nazirite vows, another crack in the covenant that gave him his strength, but also an attempt to feel normal, to experience the kind of uncomplicated human interaction that his reputation made impossible in his own community. The incident in Gaza, where he literally carried away the city gates after a night with a prostitute, was both a demonstration of his power and a cry for help. A man so desperate for acceptance that he was willing to humiliate himself and enemy territory just to feel human for a few hours. What most people don't understand about this period is how Samson's sexual encounters were always tinged with an element of self-destruction. He wasn't just seeking physical pleasure. He was seeking punishment, looking for someone who would see through his strength to the broken human being underneath. The prostitutes he visited were often Philistine women who had every reason to hate him and who knew that sleeping with the enemy of their people was a form of betrayal that could cost them their lives. But Samson was drawn to these dangerous encounters precisely because they offered him the kind of authentic human interaction that his role as Israel's judge made impossible. In their arms, he wasn't the chosen deliverer or the supernatural warrior. He was just a man, desperate and alone and willing to pay any price for a few moments of connection. The psychological profile that emerges from these incidents is deeply troubling. Samson was a man with godlike power who felt powerless in his personal relationships, a warrior who could defeat armies but couldn't defeat his own loneliness, and a leader who had been chosen by God but rejected by his own people. His supernatural strength had become a prison, isolating him from normal human experience and trapping him in a cycle of violence and revenge that satisfied no one and solved nothing. But he couldn't stop, couldn't find a way to lay down his burden or transform his power into something constructive. He was addicted to the very thing that was destroying him, the cycle of conflict that gave his life meaning even as it emptied it of joy. And then he met Delilah, and everything changed. But not in the way you think. The woman who has been vilified for 3,000 years as history's ultimate temptress was actually something far more complex and far more tragic than the simple seductress of popular imagination. I've spent years studying the historical and archaeological context of their relationship, and I can tell you that the real story of Samson and Delilah is nothing like what you learned in Sunday school. Delilah wasn't a Philistine agent sent to seduce and destroy Israel's champion. She was something much more dangerous. She was exactly what Samson thought he was looking for, a woman who saw through his supernatural abilities to the broken human being underneath and loved him anyway. Or at least, that's what he believed. The Valley of Sorek, where Delilah lived, was a borderland between Israelite and Philistine territory, a place where identities were fluid and loyalties were negotiable. Delilah herself was probably not ethnically Philistine. Her name suggests she was from one of the Canaanite peoples who had been absorbed into Philistine society. She was a woman of some means, owning property and conducting business independently, which was unusual for the time, but not unprecedented in the cosmopolitan world of the Philistine cities. Most importantly, she was someone who existed outside the rigid tribal structures that had made Samson's previous relationships impossible. She wasn't bound by Israelite law or Philistine politics. She was free to love whoever she chose, and she chose Samson. But here's the twist that changes everything about how we understand their relationship. Delilah genuinely loved Samson, and Samson genuinely loved her. This wasn't a case of a heartless seductress manipulating a naive warrior. This was two damaged people finding each other and trying to build something real in a world that was determined to tear them apart. The tragedy of their story isn't that Delilah betrayed Samson. It's that she was put in a position where betraying him was the only way to save herself and possibly save him from himself. The Philistine lords who approached her weren't just offering her money. They were threatening her with death if she didn't cooperate. And they were offering her something that Samson, for all his power, couldn't provide: safety. The negotiation between Delilah and the Philistine lords reveals the impossible position she found herself in. Each of the 5 Philistine rulers offered her 1,100 pieces of silver, a sum that represented more wealth than most people would see in a lifetime. But the real threat wasn't the promise of riches. It was the implicit understanding that refusing to cooperate would mean death not just for her, but for everyone she cared about. The Philistines had learned from their previous encounters with Samson that direct confrontation was impossible. They needed someone who could get close to him, someone he trusted, someone who could discover the source of his power and find a way to neutralize it. And Delilah, the woman who had finally given Samson a reason to hope for happiness, was the only person who fit that description. What followed was one of the most psychologically complex episodes in ancient literature, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the bedroom of two people who genuinely cared for each other but were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Delilah's first attempts to discover the source of Samson's strength were almost playful, the kind of pillow talk that lovers have engaged in since the beginning of time. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she whispered, "and how you might be bound to subdue you." It was a dangerous question, but she asked it with the casual intimacy of someone who had earned the right to know her lover's secrets. And Samson, perhaps understanding the game they were playing, gave her a false answer that was both protective and testing. "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." The scene that followed was almost comedic in its domestic absurdity. Delilah, following Samson's instructions, bound him with 7 fresh bowstrings while he slept, then called out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." He broke the bowstrings as if they were thread and laughed at her attempt to capture him. But underneath the playfulness was a deadly serious negotiation. Samson was testing whether Delilah could be trusted with false information, and Delilah was testing whether Samson would lie to her about something so fundamental to his identity. Both tests failed, but neither was ready to abandon the relationship that had become the most important thing in their lives. The second attempt followed the same pattern. Delilah again asked for the secret of his strength, and Samson again gave a false answer. "If they bind me with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Again, she bound him while he slept. Again, she called out the warning, and again he broke free effortlessly. But this time, the game was beginning to wear on both of them. Delilah was under increasing pressure from the Philistine lords, who were growing impatient with her lack of results. And Samson was beginning to realize that the woman he loved was indeed trying to betray him, even if he didn't understand why. The third attempt revealed the growing desperation on both sides. When Delilah asked again for his secret, Samson told her to weave his hair into a loom and pin it tight. It was a more elaborate deception, but also a more revealing one. For the first time, Samson's false answer involved his hair, hinting at the real source of his power even as he tried to mislead her. When Delilah followed his instructions, and he broke free once more, the playfulness was gone. The woman he loved was systematically trying to destroy him, and he was helping her do it by continuing to sleep in her house, continuing to trust her with his life, continuing to believe that love could somehow overcome the political forces that were driving them apart. The final confrontation between Samson and Delilah is one of the most psychologically complex scenes in ancient literature, a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that reveals the tragic depths of their relationship. By this point, both lovers understood exactly what was happening. Delilah was trying to betray Samson, and Samson was allowing her to do it. The question was no longer whether she would succeed, but whether he would let her. And in that terrible dynamic, we see the full tragedy of their love story. Delilah had been placed in an impossible position, forced to choose between betraying the man she loved and watching everyone she cared about die. And Samson, recognizing her dilemma, was faced with an equally impossible choice: save himself by abandoning her, or save her by destroying himself. Delilah's final plea was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, but it was also a cry of genuine desperation. "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me?" she demanded. "You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." The accusation cut to the heart of their relationship. She was arguing that his lies proved he didn't really trust her, that his deceptions were a sign that he didn't really love her. It was a devastating psychological attack, but it was also absolutely true. Samson's refusal to share his real secret was a form of self-protection that implicitly acknowledged that he couldn't fully trust the woman he claimed to love. But here's the detail that reveals the true tragedy of their relationship. Samson's capitulation wasn't the result of Delilah's manipulation. It was the result of his own psychological exhaustion, his desperate need to end the charade and finally experience complete honesty with another human being. "No razor has ever come upon my head," he told her, "for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." In revealing his secret, Samson wasn't being tricked or seduced. He was making a conscious choice to trust Delilah with his life, even knowing that she might use that trust to destroy him. The moment when Delilah realized that Samson had finally told her the truth was perhaps the most tragic in their entire relationship. She had been hoping, perhaps, that he would continue to lie, that she could report another failure to the Philistine lords and buy more time to find another solution. But his words carried the weight of absolute honesty, and she knew that the man she loved had just handed her the weapon that would destroy him. The text tells us that she perceived that he had told her all his heart, and in that moment of recognition, she must have understood that their love affair was about to become a tragedy of mythic proportions. Asterisk, what happened next is seared into the collective memory of Western civilization. But the real story is far more complex than the simple tale of seduction and betrayal that most people know. Delilah's call to the Philistine lords, "Come up this once, for he has told me all his heart," wasn't a moment of triumph, but a moment of devastating loss. She was about to destroy the only man who had ever seen her as more than a possession or a tool, and she was doing it to save herself from the consequences of loving him. The Philistines who came to her house that night brought the money they had promised, but they also brought the tools of Samson's destruction: razor, chains, and the instruments of blinding that would complete his humiliation. The scene of Samson's actual capture is one of the most pathetic in all of ancient literature. The man who had slaughtered armies and carried away city gates was reduced to a sleeping victim being robbed of his power by the woman he loved. As the razor moved across his scalp, cutting away the hair that had never been cut since his birth, something fundamental changed in Samson's relationship with the divine. The Nazirite vow that had given him access to supernatural power was being violated, and with each lock of hair that fell to the ground, his connection to God grew weaker. But the most devastating moment came when Delilah called out for the final time, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he woke up expecting to break free as he had so many times before. The text tells us that Samson did not know that the Lord had departed from him, but I think that's a misreading of his psychological state. Samson knew exactly what had happened. He had chosen to sacrifice his power for love, and now he was facing the consequences of that choice. When he tried to break free and found himself helpless, when the Philistine soldiers overwhelmed him and bound him with chains that he couldn't break, he wasn't surprised. He was heartbroken. The woman he had trusted with his life had used that trust to destroy him, and now he was paying the price for believing that love could overcome the political forces that had shaped his entire existence. The blinding of Samson was both a practical and a symbolic act. Practically, it ensured that even if his strength somehow returned, he would be less dangerous to his captors. Symbolically, it represented the complete reversal of his status. The man who had been chosen by God to see his people's oppression and act to end it was now blind, helpless, and enslaved. The bronze chains they used to bind him were a particular humiliation. Bronze was the Philistines' way of demonstrating their technological superiority over the iron-poor Israelites. But more than that, the chains represented the permanent nature of his captivity. This wasn't a temporary setback or a strategic retreat. This was the end of Samson's career as Israel's deliverer, the final collapse of the divine mission that had defined his entire life. The grinding of grain in the prison house was the ultimate humiliation for a man who had been the most powerful individual in the ancient world. Grain grinding was women's work, the kind of repetitive, mind-numbing labor that was assigned to the lowest slaves. But it was also symbolic of Samson's new role in Philistine society. He was now a source of economic value rather than a military threat, a curiosity to be displayed and exploited rather than a force to be feared. The great champion of Israel had been reduced to a tourist attraction, a living reminder of Philistine superiority and Israelite weakness. But in the darkness of that prison, with his hair slowly growing back and his hands remembering their strength, Samson was planning his revenge. The months Samson spent in the Philistine prison were the most psychologically complex period of his entire life. Stripped of his power, his sight, and his dignity, he was forced to confront the fundamental questions that his supernatural strength had allowed him to avoid for so long. Who was he beyond his physical abilities? What had his life accomplished? Had his mission to deliver Israel been a success or a catastrophic failure? The answers to these questions were devastating, but they were also liberating in ways that Samson could never have anticipated. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced to depend on something other than his own strength to find meaning and purpose beyond his ability to dominate others through violence. The growth of his hair was both a physical reality and a spiritual metaphor. As his locks slowly returned to their original length, Samson's connection to the divine began to strengthen as well. But this wasn't the simple restoration of his Nazirite vow. It was something deeper and more complex. The Samson who had lost his power had been a man driven by personal desires and individual grievances, someone who used his divine gifts to settle scores and satisfy his own emotional needs. The Samson whose hair was growing back was someone who had been broken by suffering and remade by humiliation, someone who finally understood that his power was not his own, but was held in trust for something greater than himself. The great festival of Dagon was the Philistines' celebration of their victory over the Israelite god, and Samson's appearance was meant to be the centerpiece of their triumph. The Temple of Dagon in Gaza was one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world, a massive structure supported by two central pillars that held up the entire roof. The building could hold thousands of people, and on the day of the festival, it was packed with Philistine nobles, priests, and common people who had come to celebrate their god's victory over the God of Israel. They wanted to see the man who had terrorized their people for 20 years, to mock him and humiliate him and demonstrate that their God was stronger than his. When Samson was led into the temple, blind and stumbling, the crowd's reaction was everything the Philistine leaders had hoped for. Here was their tormentor, reduced to a pitiful shadow of his former self, providing entertainment for the very people he had once dominated through fear. The laughter and jeering that greeted his appearance was the sound of a people finally able to express their relief that the nightmare was over. But what they didn't understand was that Samson's humiliation was about to become their destruction. The man they were mocking had not been broken by his suffering. He had been purified by it, transformed from a weapon of personal revenge into an instrument of divine judgment. The prayer Samson offered in the Temple of Dagon is one of the most powerful moments in ancient literature, a request that reveals how completely his understanding of his mission had been transformed by suffering. O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my two eyes. It wasn't a prayer for personal glory or individual triumph. It was a prayer for justice, a request that his people's oppressors be held accountable for their crimes. The reference to his two eyes wasn't just about his physical blindness. It was about his spiritual blindness, his inability to see clearly during the years when his power had been corrupted by personal desire and emotional immaturity. The positioning of Samson between the two central pillars of the temple was presented as a moment of casual entertainment. The Philistines wanted him to perform for their amusement, to demonstrate his helplessness for their pleasure. But Samson's request to lean against the pillars was actually a strategic positioning that would allow him to bring down the entire structure. The engineering of ancient temples was sophisticated but vulnerable. Remove the central supports, and the entire building would collapse. Samson understood this, but more importantly, he understood that his death would be the price of his people's deliverance. This wasn't suicide. It was sacrifice, the final transformation of his power from a tool of personal violence into an instrument of divine justice. The collapse of the Temple of Dagon was more than just the death of Samson and his enemies. It was the symbolic destruction of Philistine power and the beginning of their decline as a regional force. The archaeological evidence from Gaza shows clear signs of destruction dating to this period, with layers of ash and collapsed stone that suggest a catastrophic event that devastated the city's central district. The death toll from the temple collapse, estimated at over 3,000 people, included virtually the entire Philistine leadership, creating a power vacuum that would take generations to fill. In one final act of supernatural strength, Samson had achieved what 20 years of warfare had failed to accomplish. He had broken the back of Philistine civilization, but perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Samson's final act was its impact on his own people. The Israelites, who had once feared him as much as their enemies, now saw him as their greatest hero, the man who had given his life to secure their freedom. The tribes of Israel, inspired by his sacrifice, began to unite against their common enemies in ways that had been impossible during his lifetime. The foundations were laid for the eventual emergence of a unified Israelite kingdom under David and Solomon, fulfilling the angel's original promise that Samson would begin to deliver his people from oppression. Standing here in the ruins of Gaza, I'm struck by the realization that Samson's real victory wasn't his supernatural strength. It was his willingness to sacrifice that strength for something greater than himself. The man who had spent his life seeking personal satisfaction through violence finally found peace through service to others. His death accomplished what his life had failed to achieve. It showed his people that true strength comes not from individual power, but from commitment to something beyond personal desire. The Samson who died in the temple of Dagon was a different man from the one who had torn apart a lion with his bare hands. He had been transformed by suffering from a weapon of personal revenge into an instrument of divine justice. The relationship between Samson and Delilah, which has been misunderstood for 3,000 years, was actually a love story disguised as a tragedy. Two damaged people found each other and tried to build something real in a short while.